Imagine lying on a grassy field on a pleasant summer eve and gazing up at the beauty of the night sky, at the 1/10 billion trillion and counting burning bowls of gas, each dancing to a celestial symphony arising from the inexorable beat of atomic nuclei clanging together to forge the elements of the universe and, therefore, of us. Assuming there are 20 drops in 1 milliliter of water, the density of water is 1 gram per milliliter. The molar mass of water is approximately 18.015 grams per mole. There are 6.022 times 10 to the 23rd molecules per mole. There are approximately 1.671 times 10 to the 22nd molecules of H2O in just half a milliliter of water, or roughly an equivalent number of molecules as stars in the sky. Thus, all existence is relative. The sum of every quark to every galaxy is dwarfed still by the vast expanding whole of the universe. Things are not always as we think they are. In a mere 10 drops of water, there are more than 10 sextillion water molecules. Organic simplicity and yet astounding complexity. Nevertheless, where, in amidst these unfathomable figures, do we 7 billion humans belong? Each of us composed of over 7 billion more atoms. Indeed, what is significant about the way in which those atoms are combined? In essence, what does it mean to be a human, or an aspen, or a bacterium? As scientist Carl Sagan eloquently and profoundly observed, the cosmos is within us. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the universe to know itself. We, as bits of stardust, as conscious extensions of the cosmos, simply by being, enable the universe to have its own kind of transcendent experience of consciousness. But what does consciousness really mean? Where amongst the 7 octillion atoms of the human body do we find the font of consciousness? Where amongst the plethora of parts is the I? And what then about consciousness, in and of itself, is uniquely human? And so this is the question. What is consciousness? That has puzzled philosophers for millennia, more recently intrigued cognitive scientists and AI researchers, and remains, if perhaps more latent, when anyone goes out, looks up at the night sky and asks the questions, who am I? What am I? What is my purpose? Do I have a purpose? Is there a God? Am I alone? Right, sort of this whole litany of questions burgeoning forth. And so, really, sort of what those questions, if perhaps more latent, sort of getting at is this idea: what is consciousness? Sort of what does it mean to have an experience of the world? And so I'd like to explore this deeply probing inquiry today. And before we even begin, some may say, what is the value in entertaining such a question? What is the nature of consciousness? What value do we have to gain from such a discussion? Well, there are multitudinous benefits, but mainly the idea is that how we understand this question, what is consciousness, how we answer that, impacts how we understand ourselves and our place in this vast universe of ours. And how we understand ourselves in turn shapes how we conduct ourselves, and therefore impact others, other denizens of this universe. And so, in other words, our understanding of this question precedes and therefore predicates our agency, how we act within this universe. So, some pretty profound implications if you think about that point. But okay, to begin, how might we tackle this question? Well, why not turn to the dictionary? It's obviously not the best idea, but it is an idea nonetheless. It's a good place to start, at least. To look at what other people have said, and from there we can build up our own repertoire of ideas. Okay, so if we were to look at the Oxford Dictionary, the definition of consciousness would be the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings. So the state of being awake and aware of one's surroundings, from the Oxford Dictionary. Being awake and aware. Okay, this is sort of hitting on good points. Being awake and aware. And if you think about sort of how we might use consciousness or conscious in sort of more of a less philosophical sense, sort of being awake, being aware, being cognizant. So this is a good starting place. This idea of sort of what is being awake, and then really awareness of surroundings. And I think many of you also may be familiar with consciousness in terms of a more psychological definition as well. I think there's the famous image that might come to mind of a Freudian iceberg, right, where 6/7 of the meaning is below this limen, Latin for threshold. You sort of have this peak of what we would call consciousness, sort of the experience of being awake. We're sort of aware directly what's going on. And then we sort of have this subliminal region, we would call the preconscious. And that's sort of things like memories and associations, other things that sort of are more latent, sort of aren't manifest per se, but sort of, it's like the tip of the tongue phenomenon. When you're sort of onto something, you can retrieve it with relative ease. Maybe more, less or more than other times, but it's sort of retrievable. And then down here, sort of have this, boiling, seething, unconscious sort of. In Freudian psychology, that's sort of where the repressed memories live of abuse and other painful experiences, sort of buried deep down. and the idea that this would be the subconscious, sort of everything below the conscious limit. So I'll just say this is Freud's iceberg principle. But even now, in more modern psychology, and even in psychoanalysis, sort of stemming really from the work Freud did, sort of modern psychology has distanced itself from many ideas, of Freud's, namely this, that sort of everything is coming from, childhood sexual abuse or sexual tension, right? But notwithstanding that, what's important, I think, is this idea that consciousness is a rather loaded term, as you might already have guessed. So it isn't, because if there was a simple, straight answer, I mean, we humans have been searching at the, for an answer, thinking about it for millennia, right? And so for part of our species history, sort of entertaining this question. But the idea, I think, being that this excellently represents is that there is a lot more to consciousness than sort of what might meet the eye. That in the workings of a brain or another, nervous system analog, there's a lot going on beneath the surface, stuff that we may not be aware of, but that is contributing to the experience. And so within the term of consciousness, we actually have sort of this idea of the subconscious, stuff that we aren't necessarily aware of, so things that we're sort of processing naturally. Our brain sort of takes in all these kinds of all this kind of sensory information and integrates it into this one whole that we can rather easily interact with. And we call that reality. So I think interesting just look into sort of more psychological implications with consciousness. But now, okay, in a more philosophical sense, what Moody, this scholar in 1994, and then Flanagan and Polgar in 1995, essentially what they're going to look at is the concept of the philosophical zombie and conscious inessentialism. And by philosophical zombie, I don't mean a little, Aristotle zombie sort of in the zombie. I mean, imagine it's a zombie apocalypse, and there's this little, guy wearing a little zombie wearing a toga, sort of reading out his politics, right? Nothing of that sort. But the philosophical zombie is, as defined by Moody and then refined by Flanagan and Polgar, is the idea that you have this entity that looks like a human, talks like a human, eats like a human, sleeps like a human, dreams like a human, even thinks like a human, and yet is not a human. It's sort of this, that's why we call it a philosophical zombie, because essentially it's like a shell, an egg shell, without any egg inside of it. So it's like you have the shell of a human, devoid of consciousness. So that's the idea of what a philosophical zombie is. And this essentially underscores is the concept of conscious inessentialism, essentially that experience is not supreme. That consciousness, or conscious experience of things, that's not necessary for us to operate in this universe, to live, even to think and dream, which we might consider more conscious behaviors. Okay. In other words, what they even bring up, the latter scholars bring up, is the questions that many of you may have, such as, why do we have consciousness then? If by this idea of conscious inessentialism, consciousness isn't necessary, why evolutionarily do we have it? What is the evolutionary benefit of it? And where does that consciousness sort of exist? And so, to answer those questions, scholars Dennett, I believe 1996, and then Hofstadter, 2007, in his book I Am a Strange Loop. What Dennett essentially is going to say is the philosophical zombie is a preposterous concept, because if I have an entity that looks like a human, talks like a human, eats like a human, sleeps like a human, dreams like a human, thinks like a human, then it is a human. And the difference, this imagined difference of consciousness, is but an imaginary fabrication, right? It sort of logically doesn't make sense. And so what Hofstadter is going to say as well, to illustrate this concept, is to say, okay, entertain this Gedanken experiment. Say that I have a little old car, pretend it's a car, and I'm sort of desirous of a change. I want something with a little more oomph, but I can't afford Tesla or Ferrari, whatever, what have you. So I go to the car dealer and I say, hey, I hear you're making this nice little formula. Call it race car power. Can you add some to my little car? The idea being, I have this performance enhancing something, this magical thing, I don't know what it is, and so the dealer takes the car back, and applies whatever this race car power is, and boom, I have a super nice, little car with like flames and things. Right, so nice, cool little race car. So in other words, I take this car, I add some race car power, I endow it with this race car power, and boom, I get a race car. And so by similar logic, what Dennett and Hofstadter said, or what Dennett is saying, well, what Flanagan and Polgar are saying is, okay, say that you have a philosophical zombie, you add consciousness, and you get a human. Cogito ergo sum, right? I think therefore I am. You have a fully conscious human. But as you might have already been able to tell, there's some pretty deep flaws in this logic. Okay, well, we know that if I have a little old car, and I bring it to the dealer, no matter what powder or things I throw at it, I'm never going to come out with like a Ferrari, unless I buy a Ferrari, right? The idea then is that race car power can't be, ex hypothesis, some added ingredient, because race car power is an intrinsic property of a race car that arises naturally from the number of cylinders or gears or brakes. I'm not really a car buff, but essentially, horsepower. So essentially, the race car power is predicated of the inherent machinery of the race car. And that makes sense. I can't have a race car unless it's a race car, right? With the necessary number of cylinders and gears and braking systems and all that sort of stuff. And so what Dennett and Hofstadter are going to do is look at this latter equation, basically, and say, yeah, this can't exist. Right, so this can't exist because consciousness, like this race car power, is not something that can be extricated or ordained at the snap of a finger. Right? I can't just form this entity and say, you are conscious. Almost like sort of a, like creating, like, thing. So I can't just poof create a conscious entity unless that entity is conscious. So in other words, what they are saying, what Hofstadter is saying, is that like with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which essentially says that any system capable of number theory will contain true statements that are not provable from the axioms that define that system. And the axioms being basic assumptions about number theory. Then essentially I get these recurrent loops, right, that just happen naturally. And so what Hofstadter is going to say is that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. Emergent phenomenon, meaning that, like with the race car power, consciousness is something that happens naturally. As an organism, or potentially non-living entity, right, grows more and more complex over species or time, essentially by this necessity for self-reference due to complexity, the complexity of the system, consciousness is going to emerge naturally as a byproduct of the system. And so, in other words, that complexity of the system is going to predicate consciousness, whatever the conscious experience of that entity will be. And so I think this is quite a powerful idea, if you think about it. Because then, there are many studies and people looking, what's a specific brain area or neural cluster that is responsible for consciousness, or what is, sort of on and on like that. Actually, consciousness is sort of ingrained within our mental hardware. It's sort of this emergent phenomenon that is the product of all of the sum of its parts, right? Where that whole is greater than just that sum, sort of this gestalt, this conscious gestalt. And so that's just, I think it's a fascinating idea to think about, really mind expanding. And there's one little, not necessarily flaw, but question, at least for me, that was sort of persistent. Complexity. What is complexity? And I know this might sound like a Zen koan, trying to bite your own teeth. What is the sound of your own one hand clapping? And it is kind of this problematic thing. How do I define complexity? Right? It's sort of, without being stuck in this Gödelian, self-referential loop, right? Just sort of stuck in it forever. How do I define complexity as it relates to consciousness? Because the central idea behind Hofstadter's idea of consciousness as an emergent phenomenon is that consciousness happens naturally as a system grows more complex. Okay, that's a great idea. But what is complexity? How do we define that? How do we define complexity? How do we define consciousness such that we can account for the meaning behind complexity? I mean, just, sort of if you're looking at, Dugesia tigrina, this little worm with this funny face that I'll try and put up on the screen, versus Homo sapiens, right? Man, woman, humanity, sort of both are conscious entities, but where do we, I mean, there's a huge disparity between a 1 millimeter long tape, little flatworm, and human beings such as myself, such as yourself. So how do we define consciousness such that we account for this quite stark variation among conscious entities, and possibly, as I've hinted at before, enable a way to sort of look at that, maybe measure it, and extend consciousness beyond the living entities to non-living ones. And so what I think, what I'm sort of saying is that, as Margulis and Sagan, 1995, sort of said that every autopoietic entity is conscious. In other words, that every entity that is able to renew and maintain itself by maintaining its boundaries, or maintaining its composition, renewing its boundaries. Essentially, every living creature with a certain amount of complexity, essentially is conscious. And so what I'd like to show is look at how we might define what complexity means in terms of consciousness, how we can define consciousness such that we account for that complexity, and to show that as every, if taking Margulis and Sagan a step further, if every autopoietic entity is conscious, well, not every conscious entity is autopoietic. So I'll be right back, and I'll offer my thoughts for what they're worth on a system of ordered consciousness. Okay. And so, for a complete overview of my system of ordered consciousness, I would definitely suggest checking out my essay, which I'll include a link to in the description. But sort of in lieu of that, sort of for a more more of a sort of overview, then I shall proceed. Okay, so essentially, what this system does is, let's say, okay, we have the term consciousness. And now let's break that down. To three component parts, three sub-parts. Of P consciousness, short for proto, proto-consciousness, neo, N consciousness, U, ultra. It's just ultra. So proto, neo, and ultra. The idea is that this layer, this sublayer, is what's called, I'll just write it here, this sort of layer is what's called the order. And now the order, hence ordered consciousness, right? The order is essentially like the class. And order is a mathematical term from different orders of differential equations. Essentially, where the higher the order is, the more complex a system you're dealing with. So the idea is that as a measure of complexity, we can break consciousness down into sort of these constituent parts. We call them orders, from proto, neo to ultra. And the idea is that we have a spectrum. That's an emergent phenomenon, right? Where we sort of start with proto, sort of, more basic, moving up to neo, and then ultra. And the idea is that these orders are predicated on axioms. So I know I've used this word before in the context of number theory and Gödel's incompleteness theorem. The idea is that I have statements that form the basis for a particular order of consciousness. So if I am P consciousness, I will have to meet these axioms, which I'll get to in a minute. So we have these identifiable orders, these subcomponents of consciousness, to sort of break things down. But I'll do you one better. We're going to break down each order into what are called degrees. And now a degree, it's going to be these little, we're going to have a whole another little subspectrum, these degrees, which I'll write out momentarily. Another mathematical term coming from talking about polynomials and how, here I'll move to the side, maybe that helps a little bit, you can see, and polynomials and how the higher degree a polynomial is, the more complex it's going to be. So again, keeping with this idea, this mathematical theme of complexity, by sort of analyzing what's going on. And so, okay, within each order, proto, neo, ultra, we are going to have 5 degrees. And they're going to start with little h, hypo, little s, sub, b, base, big S, supra, and then big H, hyper. And the idea is that these are going to apply to each of the orders. With the idea then that within each order of consciousness there exist subspectra that are all part of the larger spectrum of consciousness, whereas we move to the right, we are increasing in complexity. So increasing in complexity as we move from left to right, primarily, so again, so within the term of consciousness, break that down, we have 3 orders, where the orders are going to essentially represent the class, the principal difference group that we're going to place conscious entities into. And then within each order, we have these degrees, which one can think of as almost like significant figures or something, because they provide this intra-order sort of higher grained accuracy. We can talk about, okay, well, if I have P-conscious entities, well, I can sort of place them within that order corresponding to some degree. And again, so these degrees are really, proxies, because in the ideal world, we can actually perform tons of analysis on various living and perhaps non-living systems to essentially standardize each order within the degree, so that we can clearly identify using mathematics, and statistics basically, to figure out, okay, what's our sort of base P conscious entity or N conscious entity, and then okay, from there, well, if this is like the 0 point, basically, then almost like in a z-score, or something in statistics, excuse me, I can look, okay, well, what if I'm a little bit, like a standard deviation or two to the left of that? What if I'm a standard deviation or two to the right of that? And then sort of more of the extremes, the and hyper. That's the idea, sort of the goal. And at this point, so it's still sort of theoretical analysis, but that's the goal for this more, really being more accurate in terms of intra-order analysis. Right. And so, okay, what I'll do right now is take a closer look at the first two orders of consciousness, namely proto and neo. Okay. So P consciousness, again for short, proto. So a P conscious entity is going to be like that Dugesia tigrina we saw earlier, sort of the little funny 1 millimeter flatworm with the funny face. So essentially, a P conscious entity is going to have what I call an R ego. And an R ego, from the preposition inter, meaning among or between, interego, because essentially the interego is going to exist solely in the context of the environment. So in other words, Dugesia tigrina is conscious, is P conscious, but as we'll see, but is not, but sort of lacks a sense of self. It sort of can interact with its environment, and but it lacks a self identity that is independent of its environment. We'll sort of get to that a little bit more. So in other words, for a P conscious entity will have an R ego. And the R ego, essentially, as I said, is predicated on axioms and their definitions. So essentially, I know that I can say, for example, R1. R1. The definition of the first axiom for the R ego is that the entity must be able to perceive phenomena of its environment. Okay, so as we kind of said, harking back to the Oxford Dictionary definition, being awake and aware of one's environment. So an awareness of the environment. Well, obviously to be aware, you have to perceive. In some sense, be able to perceive the environment. Okay, but say, for example, I take this little piece of chalk. How do I know it's not perceiving its environment? I mean, sure, if we were taking, a human, for example, or Dugesia tigrina, we could say, oh, well, I have eyes, so I have visual receptors, I have auditory receptors, I have tactile receptors, olfactory receptors. So I can sort of rattle off a list of sensors that I have that I interact with the world. I interpret the world through. So this chalk, how do I know it doesn't have some kind of transcendent awareness about it? Okay, well, because this is where the second axiom will sort of clear things up. So not only must an entity perceive, but in order that we actually can verify that it's perceiving, essentially, it has to be able to act independently and deliberately on those perceptions. And this is where sort of this sticky case of, well, what if I have a sensor? Some kind of probe that I'm putting out into the world, does that really count? And based on this axiom, the answer would be no. Because some sensor might be able to perceive phenomena of its environment, but even if it's then triggering some alarm or triggering some, or, you know, recording that data or whatever, it's not acting independently. It can't, like Duguessis can sense, you know, be able to sense, you know, food particles or whatnot, and then be able to move towards those food particles. So you could, in theory, you know, put a human and a cake in a room, and then, okay, we'll see. Well, will the human go for the cake? It might look at it. Or it doesn't have to eat the cake. Like the Duguessis wouldn't have to eat whatever food it found. But the idea is that you could show that you can show, you know, you can empirically measure some behavior that is deliberate and independent from others' perceptions. And so this axiom, in terms of an implication, sort of is going to demonstrate that all conscious entities, whether they are just purely, you know, low, you know, the lowest on the spectrum, P conscious entity, are going to have some amount of free will. They not need to be aware of that free will, and of course, you know, and that free will is not unlimited. I can't, as a human, say I want to fly and then start flapping my arms and expect to, you know, counteract gravity. So it's, for living organisms, it's going to be, that free will is going to be biologically restricted. But the idea, I think, is kind of interesting. Another philosophical idea connecting consciousness to that is that that to be conscious is to have free will. And again, that doesn't mean you can exercise it necessarily. If you're locked in a room, you can't get out, whatever. But the idea is that you have a capacity for free will, a capacity to act. Okay. And now, okay, what if we want to look at end consciousness? Sort of that next order up. Well, an end-conscious entity is going to be one that has an R-ego, but is also going to have what's called an A-ego. A for intra, or within. Within. And so what's key about this is that an end-conscious entity isn't simply one floating out there, sensing some food, moving there, sensing some food, moving there, resting, moving, sort of just in what we might say more mindless, even though Duguessis does have a nervous system, is using that to filter and integrate perceptions. The idea is that with the A-ego, you get a sense of self. Sort of what we might more readily associate with consciousness. That I am aware of my existence. And so, as per here, over here, we're going to have various axioms and then our definitions. So axiom A1, for example, is going to tell us, okay, an end-conscious entity, one with this A-ego, as well as an R-ego, is going to have to be able to understand the self independently. And this is what we discussed with Duguessis earlier, that were other simple, more just P-conscious entities, that independently, that they're not going to have a sense of self that can be extricated in some sense from its environment. And of course, we humans, even we end-conscious entities, we'll get to later, are of course a partial product of our environments as well. And so, again, one's identity will never be necessarily wholly separate from the environment. But the idea is that I'm not merely a part of the environment, but I see myself, I'm aware of myself as an individual actor in the context of that, in that environment. And so A2 also going to be, must understand the self in the context of its environment, both physically and socially, kind of getting to another a later implication. And then to kind of bring up this question, well, okay, what is understanding? Get to that in a second. How am I, like here, how can we verify empirically that an entity actually is understanding, right? Well, to answer that, the entity must be able to manifest that understanding, essentially. Manifest that understanding independently and deliberately. Must manifest the understanding independently and deliberately through expression. Expression, symbolic and behavioral. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. Let's kind of digest a little bit in terms of the end-conscious axioms. So again, end-conscious. So whereas a P-conscious entity is simply going to have an R-ego, so essentially be able to perceive phenomena of its environment, and then act independently and deliberately on those perceptions. An end-conscious entity is essentially going to have this awareness of the environment, but with an awareness of the self. So taking that perception, from a more superficial level, and adding the depth that we might more readily associate with consciousness. But again, I would argue that this too is consciousness because it is essentially awareness. Awareness and being aware of the environment and be able to act upon it. It's sort of a basic definition of consciousness in this sense. But again, over here, this idea of understanding, okay, well, what does it mean to understand, right? It's pretty deep, another deep question, right? So essentially, what I'm going to say is that understanding is essentially the internalization of some concept by a subject relative to itself. In other words, beyond this sort of superficial perception, this is where we get deriving meaning. So being able to not just sort of perceive, but to understand, to sort of get, arrive at these, or, discern these causal relationships between stimuli. And so it's going to be this understanding of relationships between stimuli, or relationships between the self and others, that is really going to fuel that higher order cognitive functioning. Because again, to understand, right, it depends that that internalization is predicated on higher order cognitive functioning. You can't just be a little 1 millimeter flatworm floating out there. You need the requisite cognitive machinery in order to form memories, to think abstractly. And so that's where the notion of complexity is going to come in, right? Really here, having the cognitive abilities necessary for this understanding. And that's sort of still, again, really worth looking into, where, that's why looking at the degrees, where within that sort of do we start with the earliest sense of self in some entity. And again, to sort of test for that, we can consider numerous things. Like, I think language is pretty much, that's a form of expression. But again, it doesn't have to be symbolic. It could also be behavioral. But again, typically some kind of language, some form of communicating. Also the mirror test is one famous instance, essentially where entities will look in a mirror, and if they can recognize their reflection, then they understand themselves as an entity, as an independent entity. Also, kind of looking more in terms of cognitive abilities, the EQ, or encephalization quotient. I'll put this on the screen just because I don't have lots of room to write here. Will be, which is one measure of sort of expected brain weight relative to body weight versus actual. Sort of measure brain density, brain size, and then theoretically, neuronal connections and whatnot. But again, not perfect, but just ideas for things. And so there are obviously, as kind of hinted at with free will, many important implications. One of them being adaptability. This, because if you can act independently and deliberately on perceptions, you can adapt to your environment. You can sort of form these connections, if perhaps more nascent, because we're peak conscious, and that's obviously going to be bolstered with the end consciousness. But the idea that I think Ms. Mihilkar 2018 showed that E. coli bacteria can be classically conditioned. They can learn connections because they were classically conditioned to better perform in rhamnose, this pentose sugar, when they were sort of pre-induced with sorbitol, this sugar alcohol. So even this tiny little bacteria, E. coli bacteria, can learn without a brain. So I think the central point that a conscious mind is not necessarily a biological brain. Another deep point I think worth pondering a bit. Also, the idea of community as an implication, sort of the context of its environment both social and physical, right? I think thinking of the infamous words of or the eloquent words of John Donne, that no man is an island in and of himself, that we are, humanity is predicated on community, not on individuals toiling in isolation. But we sort of exist, we have this communal identity, which is central to our existence. And again, what Margulis and Sagan are going to say in their On Life, or What is Life? That essentially consciousness, from from the laws of thermodynamics perspective, it makes sense to conserve energy essentially by having a centralized conscious experience. Imagine if every cell in your body had a conscious experience. What would that feel like? That would be unbelievably chaotic. So there's a centralization that happens, and sort of identifying how that happens, when that happens, in the context of the degrees, I think, to help between the P-conscious and the N-conscious, is something to be definitely interesting. I mean, it's kind of interesting. There are 100 million neurons in our gut. So maybe the gut feeling actually has something, something there. But interesting from a more energy conservation point of view as well. And I think above all, the point about this system, no, it's not perfect. And as Albert Einstein said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So yes, it is complex, and we'll kind of get more into that. But the main point is that it's universality, that essentially any system that meets these axioms, regardless of whether or not they are animals, it could be plants, even non-autopoietic, non-living entities, as long as they meet these axioms, they are conscious to that particular degree, and then order, and then degree. And so that's kind of the point. It's non-anthropocentric, and it's going to allow us to engage in some more high-level discussion about consciousness in certain entities. And so now we'll take a quick look at ultra consciousness, the other order, and then move on to some examples. Okay, so as before said, I kind of want to look at what you consciousness might be. And truth be told, okay, so I'll just write it. So what is you consciousness? Drop better you here. What is you consciousness? And so in the before graphic where I had showed the different degrees for each order, technically there should just be a giant question mark about ultra, even if it exists. And here's why. Because here it's something I liken to our sort of spatial, geometrical, mathematical perception of things. So say if I wanted to consider the nth dimension for R1, one-dimensional, I know I'm just going to have like something like a line, just one-dimensional. We can understand that. We've done plenty of work as children and now older with lines or one-dimensional objects. Like, I just sort of imagine this this ruler, sort of the line, this 1 meter long line, right? That would be a one-dimensional object. And if I wanted to consider a two-dimensional object, could look at a plane, right? A three-dimensional object could look at a cube, or this is not a cube, but like a prism. And then, but what about R4? What, if I know I have this line, this plane, and then this this cube essentially composed of these composite planes put together. And I knew I can have, I can this chalk, it's a three-dimensional object. This is no new news to us, right? But again, what about talking about a fourth dimension? And okay, maybe like talk about space-time or something. But even if I was going to say, okay, well, what if I take like my position, I sort of, or imagine I have my position, and then I sort of layer that as time progresses or something, to sort of show the change through time. That's still a spatial analogy. So in other words, I can't think in four dimensions. I can't understand. We as humans cannot understand the world in 4 dimensions. That's just by the nature of our nature, by sort of our cognitive framework. We can't understand in more than 3 dimensions for spatial, for sort of graphical type of applications. And so the idea with the you consciousness then, with ultra consciousness, is that it's sort of like this inability to understand. We don't really know how to represent it necessarily, but that doesn't mean it can't exist, right? I can have up to R infinity. I can have in any number of dimensions I want. Just watch my video on the golden number, where I talk about linear algebra or the general Stokes theorem. And so basically, it's just because we can't think of what it might be doesn't mean it can't exist. But what that means is I don't have axioms. So I can't rattle off a list of axioms at the moment, maybe later. Not just sort of if I think of them, but if sort of at some point in our species evolution or my own sort of evolution, we arrive to some understanding of what this sort of conscious understanding beyond our own, sort of universal unknown, right? And almost kind of verging on like a psychedelic type thing, or not psychedelic, but psychics sort of being able to, or precognition. But I think kind of stemming from perhaps hallucinations or something. But I'm not suggesting, oh well, consciousness is sort of just like, precognitive ability necessarily. We don't know we just don't know what this might look like. And so we sort of have to be content with no axioms yet, but in sort of the idea of of evolution, that it sort of makes sense that there is a next step, that we are not simply the most conscious, most advanced beings that are in the universe. And because this sort of this spectrum applies across time, so that at some point, even if we are long gone or much more advanced, it's possible that there are species out there in the universe, maybe ourselves, many or further, our species many generations hence, that we have some kind of transcendent experience of consciousness. And so something, just as a sort of, to not leave you completely empty-handed, we could look at the 2016 film Arrival, based on the Story of My Life by Ted Chiang, great science fiction author. And this is a great movie. If you have not seen Arrival, watch it. This will be spoilers. But the idea in Arrival is that there is a linguist named Louise Banks, and essentially what she's discovering is that there's this there are these alien creatures called heptapods, and they have this language based on what we would call circular ideograms. In other words, something like a Zen enso, sort of like something like some kind of a circle or something. The idea being that their language, their written language, instead of expressing sounds like our English language does, you actually have a language, perhaps more like Chinese, where the writing expresses ideas. So you can have characters that, instead of standing for consonants or vowel sounds, they stand for ideas. So that's a really interesting idea about language. But the point is that in the movie, Louisa Banks essentially is learning this language, this alien language. And as she's learning the language, she sees memories, quote unquote, of her future, of the child that she will have and lose to cancer. So definitely heartbreaking, poignant there. But so what's really interesting is it's sort of exploring the idea of the Sapir-Whorfian hypothesis of linguistic determinism. That idea, that language shapes thought. And so the idea with the Arrival is that if our grammatical constructs of language for verb tense typically would be present, perfect, future. So like, I am doing something, I have done something, or I will do something, kind of basically a present, a past, and a future. Sort of might break some sort of common discussion of time in sort of this linear fashion, that we have the past going to the present, going to the future. Sort of, one way. If you're for the Romans or the Greeks, you actually looked. It was like you're walking backwards because you saw the past, and you're walking sort of basically blinded into the future. You can't see the future, but you can see the past. Although we, sort of more modern cultures tend to think we're walking forward because it's sort of walking towards something, towards a dream. Sort of the future is brighter, whereas for the Romans and Greeks, the past was sort of brighter. Sort of that was the golden age, the silver age, and now we're in the iron age. We're sort of moving forward but degrading. But so for the Sapir-Whorfian hypothesis of linguistic determinism, what's really cool about that is we can, even though this, the Arrival movie is science fiction, we can see evidence of linguistic determinism across languages. And in fact, this heptapod language was actually based on the Hopi language, which Benjamin Whorf studied. And what was interesting about the Hopi language is that there is no time. They don't have a past, present, and a future tenses for verbs. To them, everything is sort of happening simultaneously, rather like this circle. The time is sort of, in other words, they make no distinction between completed actions and concurrent or ongoing actions, which is really interesting because then that affects how they look at the world, how they sort of think of time. And obviously, seeing the future is a pretty drastic extent. And in terms of what altered consciousness might look like then, I mean, obviously, if Louise Banks is able to not only, I mean, she's a human, so not only can she understand herself as an entity, as an independent entity, understand herself as an entity in the context of her environment, and then manifest that understanding through language and other forms of expression. But she is aware of a self yet to exist. A whole environment, whole world yet to exist. Which obviously makes her aware, makes her conscious to a higher degree and possibly order than her other humans. But of course, this is science fiction, not reality, and so we still wouldn't know, is she conscious or is she just a higher up on the spectrum from a human? Where is the sort of leap? And again, sort of because this model is still it's still theoretical, I feel that it's still important to just include consciousness to keep us open to the idea of evolution, that perhaps there is something beyond. Maybe there's not, but it's kind of like the question of, is there life in the universe? Is there intelligent life, maybe more intelligent than we are, or in a different universe, right? Sort of multiplex theory. I mean, it's just we have such a lack of understanding of what the true nature of what reality is, that just beyond sort of what we might define very myopically as our reality, like where we live, this room and whatever, that I think it's just anthropocentrically naive to deny that perhaps there is something. And it also sort of brings up the questions of, is there a God? Is there perhaps this transcendent super entity or something that can sort of see everything, be everything, control everything, sort of, again, not giving definitive answers on any of those fronts, but simply keeping us open to that idea. And especially, I think interesting to kind of bring up linguistic determinism in terms of how sort of connecting that to the axioms that I showed earlier, in that obviously to perceive and then to be able to manifest some understanding or some awareness, whether you're sort of more N-conscious or P-conscious of those perceptions, that's going to give us a form of consciousness. But what's interesting, as the Sapir-Whorfian hypothesis sort of leads us to, is the idea that, well, the nature of what you can perceive and how you perceive actually shapes how you understand, or for more P-conscious entities, basically, in essence, that how you perceive what you perceive, the nature of your perception, is going to directly characterize the nature of your consciousness. And so just, if you were to ask a Spaniard to describe a bridge, un puente, that's a masculine noun. And grammatical gender is something, obviously, there's a whole lot of language. We're just sort of very scratching the surface of the iceberg, right? But, to a Spaniard, because there's this whole idea that English doesn't really have of grammatical gender, a Spaniard, because un puente is masculine, is going to be more likely to describe that bridge or a bridge as strong, or sturdy, or imposing. Whereas if you're a German and you ask someone in German to describe a bridge, a German will say, "Oh, ein Brücke," feminine, bridge, describe it perhaps more as elegant, or as delicate, or as sort of less imposing, more maybe connected to the landscape or something. And of course, that doesn't mean that that sort of that's how Spaniards are only going to think of bridges as strong. They can't ever see a bridge as delicate, and vice versa for the Germans. No, but what that's just saying is that yes, the language that we speak is going to shape our perception, and again, that perception is going to shape our understanding, and therefore our nature of our consciousness. So kind of interesting, a little more digression here, but just something to consider insofar as what is you consciousness. So in some, for you consciousness, again, we don't really know. We can't list axioms. It's sort of beyond our understanding, but again, that doesn't mean it can't exist. But we may be able to come to describe it, even if we cannot experience it. And so that part of it is, I think, why it's useful keeping it around. And again, just also in the perspective that, from an evolutionary perspective, we can't be the only, sort of the pinnacle of conscious existence. Maybe now we are. Maybe we're the only life in this universe. But I don't think that, a priori, we can't have anything that we couldn't necessarily have consciousness. Okay, so now we'll kind of take a break from this and shift gears to looking at actual examples, to sort of put the theory into practice, and look at how this might actually help us, sort of from where we might be able to go with this, and then we'll wrap up. All right. So now let's put this framework to use and formally consider two examples, one living and one non-living. And we'll start with the latter first. So for a non-living entity, let's consider Waymo. Waymo, which is a self-driving car that actually grew out of a Google project. So it's obviously an artificial intelligence system that's sort of built into these cars, and equipped with these sensors, and it's essentially, as it says, it's it's a self-driving car, so it's going to navigate it's designed to navigate a various road systems as safely and as carefully and as efficiently as possible. And insofar as we're concerned, and actually, so the main Waymo website, I'll include a link to that. Obviously not sponsored by them or anything, but I think it's really cool what they're doing. There's actually this video that gives a sort of one of those 3D YouTube videos where you can sort of scroll around and look while the video is playing. And you can do VR headsets or whatever. And so I recommend looking at that video because you actually get excuse me, a pretty good look at what Waymo is actually seeing, which is pretty interesting. And so, okay, insofar as we're concerned, well, Waymo uses of various sensors, including LiDAR, radar, and then camera footage. And so with the LiDAR, essentially what it does is it sent there's a little like on top of each car there's this little box. That's where it has the camera, the radar, where it has all the sensors. And what it does at the top of this car, it basically sends out millions of laser pulses every second. And what it does is from those laser beams, it constructs a 3D, 360-degree representation of the world up to 3 football fields. 3 football fields away. So, I mean, 300 yards, 360 degrees, and 3-dimensional representation. That's just, I mean, that's huge. That's way more than even just one normal human driver is able to perceive. I mean, okay, maybe you can see much longer, but still, if they're buildings or other things, you know, so it's quite, so it has this whole representation. It's up to every second, so it's always paying attention, always looking at the road and sort of learning from that. With the radar, right, essentially it sends out these radar beams, right, using sound sort of, and it can detect the distance. Oops. So the distance to objects, whether they're, you know, sort of on the road or you know, off to the side, like buildings or other cars or other humans, just, pedestrians or dogs or balls rolling on the road, distance and their velocity. So not merely their speed, but where, sort of look at where they're actually moving. And from that, it'll actually do some cool things I'll catch in a minute, actually based on prediction. It's pretty cool. Okay, then with the camera footage, it is going to get the other visual information like stop signs, stop lights, that are integral parts of the driving experience, but simply a 3D representation and a distance and speed of other objects is not going to get you. Okay, and so the point of this is to say, okay, well, insofar as ordered consciousness, obviously it's going to meet R1, right? The idea that it can perceive its environment, because obviously it has this bevy of sensors, and is able to create this construction, this representation of the world, essentially be able to measure the distance to objects and their respective velocities, and then also look at other things like stop signs, stop lights, that of these other signals, right, sort of in the environment that would help it better function. But then what's central then too is with this perceptions, all these perceptions essentially, is able to integrate all those different perceptions every second, right? Updating every second, and sort of enmesh them in this one gestalt, and from that, it can deliberately and independently act. So it can deliberately act independent of any human, without direct human interference. Because, in other words, it can navigate roadways and obstacles So not just sort of follow along the road and then, oh, I have a rock or a car and it freaks out. No, it's always updating its environment. It can detect these obstacles and either take evasive action or in most cases just try and slow down, not slam on the brakes, but slow down, mindful of its passengers, and allow whatever's happening to sort of work itself out. So, again, this goes to say, from here, obviously it meets the requirements for the inter-ego second axiom, because not only can it perceive its environment, but it can act in its environment, and independent of any human control. I mean, it's driving. There's no human at the wheel, no human at some laptop controlling it. It's autonomous, right? It's just going, and then deliberately it can act of its own volition to follow roads and to be like an Uber or something for passengers without any actual human driver. And so it's really okay, but the problem is Waymo has no sense of self. It has no understanding per se of what any of this means, right? I mean, it doesn't have a way of. It's sort of just like programming. It doesn't have it's sort of more instinct based. It's not. It doesn't have a way. It can't. It doesn't have sort of an independent sense of self, because it only exists in the context of its environment. It has no perception of itself otherwise. It doesn't view itself as this. It can't view itself as an entity. It doesn't have a concept of self. So it would fail A axioms. It would fail the A axioms because it doesn't. Where we run into trouble is in the realm of understanding, and to this idea of motivation, like for unconscious particularly, there's this idea for if one can understand, then one can sort of be motivated to want to understand more, to sort of have these desires of things, this curiosity, which obviously Waymo does not have. It lacks sort of a capacity for higher order cognitive functioning. That doesn't mean it can't have these perceptions and create these basically these interpretations, but it's going to lack an understanding of a way to understand relative to itself. And so for that reason, it is going to be using the model of ordered consciousness, SHP conscious. And so we can talk a little bit about this sort of with the system, the notation. So the final letter is always going to be either P, N, or U, because those are the orders. So the final letter is always the order. And now, these letters will account for the degree. The main degree is going to come first. So it is primarily supra, of degree supra, but hyper, indicating that if you were to draw, sort of look at that subspectrum again, right, where sort of have the base, sub, hypo, base, super, supra, hyper. If it's supra, and the supra's going to essentially run, it has its own little spectrum there, hyper is going to put it more here, so somewhere between supra and hyper. And the idea is, remember, when I discussed degree earlier, the idea that you can almost consider it like a significant figure. We can add as many of these little like sub degrees as we want. So this would be main. Main degree supra, so primarily supra, but it's sort of up, more going towards hyper. Sort of this, but plus more is on the right side. Again, reflecting its ability as an agent within its environment in terms of its not just only perceptions, but creating these interpretations that are going to be quite crucial to its success, obviously, as a self-driving car. Okay, and so to switch gears, no pun intended, to switch gears and look at a living entity, we can consider, one second, the graceful bottlenose dolphin. Let me fix that. Bottlenose dolphin, also known as Tursiops truncatus. Okay, so bottlenose dolphin, Tursiops truncatus. Okay, so obviously there's a bevy of scholarly literature we can pull from, but I guess sort of primarily, if we wanted to look at one example, Janink's 2013 would be a good example. And dolphins are incredibly talented creatures, obviously. You know, just as an example of their modes of perception, I mean, you know, they can perceive things visually, tactily, you know, with sort of touch, with olfactory receptors, presumably as well. So visual, also through sonar, right? Echolocation. Similar to how Waymo was able to perceive distance objects and then their respective velocities. Well, dolphins also have that ability. And so we know that they're going to meet R1 and R2 because we know that dolphins have a variety of ways of perceiving the world. And probably most well known would be echolocation. And then, of course, they can act on those perceptions. We know that they can use echolocation to find a fish, say, or another dolphin, and then they can swim to that entity or avoid it or whatever. They can, you know, go around rocks or whatever. So we know that they can perceive the world and then act on those perceptions. So thus they will. So we know that the dolphin meets the axioms for the interego. But now, in terms of the other capabilities, dolphins are capable of, again, as I said, many things, including vocal learning. Sort of learn, you know, through communication, referential labeling. So to actually develop basically vocabulary by naming certain objects and or other fellow dolphins, which is pretty neat. Syntax comprehension. So dolphins can understand the difference between you know, like give X to Y or give Y to X, that sort of understand subject object, right? you give this to that, right? Which in terms of language is pretty complex, and sort of the question of, okay, is language uniquely human? I mean, dolphins are actually capable of quite a lot in terms of what we might consider language, also including joint attention, which is not necessarily language specific, but the idea of dolphins can have group cohesion, cooperation, etc. Basically, they can function together to achieve mutual goals, which is a key feature we've seen in unconscious entities, because sort of the ability to understand, to manifest that understanding through language, sort of to have the requisite mental hardware to cooperate, to share attention on shared things, to understand proto-language, to be able to label and to name things. And actually, what's cool is that dolphins can actually pass down labeling or information almost in sort of this collective corpus. Like there are these certain species or subspecies of dolphins that actually will use corals and other or sponges that basically as tools, and they can sort of pass this knowledge down, which is quite fascinating. And so the point of this, and then of course, what's interesting too for language is that they actually have variation in greetings among even within the same species, but across different locations. So it's sort of analogous to the "hello, how are you doing" versus "sup," right? Of course, even in the same language, different dialects, that sort of thing, which I think is quite fascinating. And then study by Rees and Marino in 2001 showed that dolphins actually can pass the mirror test. Again, when I mentioned in context of end consciousness, in terms of measuring, well, how do we check if an entity can understand itself as an entity in and of itself? Well, the mirror test is one of those ways, because you can show an animal its reflection, and if it can recognize it, then it sort of demonstrates that it understands itself as this entity in and of itself, this independent entity, this entity independent of its environment. It's certainly a part of its environment, but distinct in some way as its own entity. And then another study, Smith, 2010, demonstrated that dolphins have metacognitive abilities, which essentially means that dolphins can essentially be asked questions by researchers, obviously not in English, but can be prompted with these questions, these scenarios, and they can actually provide their level. They can answer a question or a task, and then they can provide their level of confidence in their answer, so they can be aware of what they're thinking. They can think about what they're thinking, which is pretty fascinating. And again, a task such as looking at yourself in the mirror and recognizing, oh, that's me, that may seem like a trivial task. We do it every morning. But it's sort of helpful to put it in perspective and think, actually, the amount of cognition required for that simple act is astounding. So there's really a lot more going on. And I think also, so what's cool about dolphins too, among other things, they actually display this cross-species empathy. Many drowning sailors can tell you that there are numerous examples of dolphins actually saving drowning sailors. And so which kind of evolutionarily doesn't make sense, because why would some member of another species save another species, right? Even if there's no direct benefit from that. And that sort of demonstrates that dolphins, sort of as you move more towards the end conscious, more to the upper echelons of the spectrum of consciousness, you sort of move away from instinct-based action, and because of your higher the species and entity's higher cognitive abilities, sort of can act more freely, more of their own volition, which is quite profound. And so all this sort of goes to say that the dolphins are going to meet the axioms for the A ego, right? Because, well, through mirror test metacognition, they are aware of themselves as an independent entity, and of course, they are aware of themselves as members in this larger environment, this larger group of species, right, with group cohesion and cooperation. And then, of course, they can manifest that understanding through what they are able to accomplish together, and through their language. I mean, it's sort of their syntax comprehension, and how they're actually able to, so the dolphins are actually able to communicate together to solve a problem, use a sort of different clicks and things. It's really, really fascinating, I think. And so in terms of understanding, to function as a group requires understanding of each of the members, working together, anticipating their behavior, but also the behavior of other animals. And so it's definitely, sort of a degree of planning and cooperation, sort of organic cooperation that transcends what Waymo's able to do, is sort of a more proto-conscious entity, lacking this ability to have a sense of self and be able to then understand and perform higher order cognitive functioning and critical thinking. And so the point of this then is, so we can say that the dolphin is going to be supra base neo conscious, again, where they are of the order neo, primarily of the order supra, but then base. Again, so they're definitely a pretty developed, pretty advanced neo-conscious entity. They have the second highest infantilization quotient, right? The ratio from the observed brain weight, brain size to the expected brain weight, brain size, given body weight and size. And so it's the second highest EQ is pretty phenomenal. And again, that's not the whole picture, obviously, but it's something. And of course, just for comparison, our order consciousness is going to be something like supra hyper neo conscious equals us. And so, the difference here is looking at the sub degree, right? So we're even of the same degree, but going to this sub component, which again just demonstrates that we are sort of the point of the system, is that we demonstrate that we are just one part of this universe, and that we share this environment, and you can have an entity that is evolutionarily pretty unrelated from us. It's not a primate, and yet is within 2 sub degrees of our consciousness. And of course, it's not the whole picture. That's not the whole defining, piece for all animals, for all dolphins, for all humans. But just sort of as a general idea, which I think is pretty fascinating. And we'll and sort of the point then too about why we care about looking at this, trying to analyze these other animals and things, is that if we understand them more, they are incredibly complex, beautiful creatures. Again, and really illustrate the similarity between us, even despite evolutionary difference, that leads to people caring more and willing to do more to protect them. And I think that it's important that we do that for other animals, other entities as well, especially moving forward with climate change and whatnot. And so that's sort of the power of what this system can do, is sort of help facilitate that awareness, put things in perspective, and ultimately have profound impacts on our lives, and ultimately make the universe a better place, which I think is the best thing that we can do. All right, so I'd like to end again by sort of going back to this question: what is consciousness? Many of you, or some of you perhaps, may be more confused than when you started, and that's good. That's what we want, because it's sort of this state of raw curiosity, of this kind of cognitive dissonance, but that sort of drives us to learn more, to do more research, to ponder, and just think and marvel at the scale of an experience that many of us take for granted, because it's just always been there, but it's incredible to think about. And so, yeah, I think we've definitely come a long way, sort of starting with that basic dictionary definition, looking up through sort of the psychological definitions or implications of consciousness, keeping in mind there's a lot more than meets the eye in terms of consciousness. It's really quite a loaded term. And then I spent most of this time presenting my thoughts on this system of ordered consciousness that I've sort of been developing as part of this course I've been taking on the nature of humanity, and so obviously there's a lot sort of going on there. Just definitely complex, but what is consciousness? What is life, right? And again, it's not to say that is what is true, and that is what that I'm not saying that my system is perfect, or that it should be universally adopted or whatever. I'm not saying any of that. All I'm saying is, hey, it's an idea. It's a thought, for whatever it's worth, and I think at least it allows us to sort of start discussing and analyzing, discoursing on consciousness, by sort of illuminating the dark void with this candle of light, sort of. I'm not intending it to be this impregnable fortress of truth per se, but rather a vehicle for further discussion, right? It's sort of to promote interest, and hopefully a basis for discovery, and a way to sort of answer this question without just trying to bite your own teeth, clap with one hand, right? Although to some extent it perhaps still is. But yeah, it's been definitely long journey, but I hope you've enjoyed this. And I think above all else, just something to take away, is that sort of the point of the system of ordered consciousness is that is its universal quintessence, that from finite seeds, these axioms, spring these infinite flowers of diversity, reaching for the stars, while remaining linked at their roots. That we are but this one infinitesimal brushstroke on the canvas of our symphonic cosmos. That from 10 drops of water to the vast expanse of space, that we and every other conscious entity are a way for the universe to know itself. I think it's just a profound thought, and you just want to smile at that. That just to think about everything, not from sort of this more solipsistic I am the only thing that exists, to look at the universe, look at it all, and we won't even be able to, we can't understand all of it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We shouldn't keep expanding what we do know, because I think what we can find is really beautiful. That we are so all intricately connected, not just as humans, but all forms of life, and even beyond life, right? That there is something more, and it's sort of our privilege to explore that and to continue fighting, continue learning, and sharing that knowledge with others, and then taking that knowledge and actually doing something with it, protecting other animals, sort of viewing, hopefully looking at humanity and saying, are we different? But that is what makes us beautiful. That's what makes us part of this universe. That we live in this incredibly diverse place, and so I think it's a manifestation of that beauty that we are such multifaceted creatures. Right? It's a testament to our humanity. It should not be a bane of our existence, right? And so we shouldn't just fight over that. Sort of see past that. See the beauty of the universe. And so that's the hope. That's the goal, which people like you and I, we can achieve. By just thinking about the universe, and then, but again, learning, but then helping others, doing something with the knowledge. And so, in light of everything that's going on, I hope you are staying safe and happy and healthy. And until next time, have fun out there in the cosmos.